All right, welcome to STAT. We're going to talk a little bit about how to collect data. This is going to be a fairly short discussion, but the overarching idea of collecting data is not a short discussion. We could spend a great deal of time talking about this and different methodologies there are in collecting a good data sample. And ultimately, it's going to come down to how much time you have and how much time you're willing to invest into that data collection. So let's just jump on in and start talking about some terms first. First of all, population. These are some rather big separations that we need to make sure that we understand. And I've mentioned these in other videos, but they're good to go back and review at this point as well. First of all, population, the group to be studied. That means the group in which that you're really concerned about the overarching behaviors. That doesn't mean that's the group that you ask all the questions to. It just means that's the group you're interested in knowing something more about. So maybe that group is oak trees. Well, you can't go out and survey every single oak tree, but the oak tree population is what you're concerned about, what's happening with the oak trees, or maybe you're talking about Sarcadias. And again, talking about that bug, you can't necessarily design a study that goes and looks at every single Sarcadia, so you have to design some other way of collecting data from that event. There's even the idea of like, well, how much oxygen does a single rainforest produce? How much carbon does it pull in, and how much oxygen does it produce? Because that is one of the processes it goes through, is pulling in carbon dioxide and releasing water and oxygen. So the carbon is actually literally being absorbed by the plant. So what does that look like? What does that process look like in terms of that rainforest? How much oxygen is it producing? How much carbon is it consuming? We can't possibly actually measure that. We can't put a plastic dome over an entire rainforest and be able to figure that out. But one of the things we can do is we can take a sample, all right, which is part of the population. So we can go out and look at a single acreage of land and say, how many Sarcadia are in this acreage, or what is the production or the lifespan of the Sarcadia in this area, or looking at a single tree or several different trees sporadically picked out throughout the entire rainforest. What is that tree producing? And even on the tree scale, like how much oxygen does a single tree produce? So there's a lot of interesting mechanisms that go into place in having to figure those pieces out. So that goes back to your sampling design, which is the method you choose to collect that sample. All right. So if we're talking about a group of people, we want to know how American people respond to a particular question, whether it was just, let's say, how do they feel about a particular political view? Well, we can't ask all 350 million citizens of the United States that question. But what we can do is we can design a system of selecting a subgroup of the U.S. citizens to ask those questions to, and get a really good sense of what the population as a whole is doing. So notice the words there. We can ask a sample of the population as a particular series of questions and have a good understanding of what the population is doing, because we can't measure the entire population. Now, how we choose that sample, how we design that data collection process itself will have an effect upon our outcome, okay? Which leads us to the next piece, which is the bias here, right? So the study has to be rooted in some good foundational pieces that prevent us from introducing error into the system. Now, the problem is, regardless of the scientific and the expertise that's put into producing a study, we are always going to have some type of error, and there's going to be some type of bias. It is a part of the system that is just going to happen. Humans are fallible, and we are going to produce things that are fallible, which means that we cannot produce a study that does not contain bias. Now, that doesn't mean that the bias in the study is intentional. What it means is that we need to become aware of the possibility of the bias that's in the system and make allowances for the bias to exist. And we also need to make a best faith effort to prevent that bias from being introduced into the system to the best of our ability. Now, again, we can't eliminate it completely, but we can put some mechanisms in place that try to limit the amount of bias that is in that system. Okay, so types of samples. Now, if we're talking about going out and asking people questions versus we're going out and measuring the oxygen production of a forest, those sampling processes look different. If we're talking about measuring the integrity of a bridge or the bridges in the United States, can we go out and survey every single bridge in the United States, or do we go out and select particular bridges in the United States and we measure those bridges, and that gives us a good picture of what the overall system looks like. So depending on our population, it's going to affect how we're picking the sample. Okay, and in some cases, we the best we can do sometimes is to limit the bias a little bit. In other cases, we can do a lot to eliminate bias. So voluntary response sample. Now this is people choosing themselves to enter into the system. So this is us setting up a table in the mall, and there's the meme. I forget the guy's name, but he has this little thing where he sets up on college campuses and other places, and he says, "Blah blah blah, changed my mind," and you're supposed to walk up and start having this conversation with him. Well, that is not a sample of data he's pulling in. Those are just conversations he's having, interviews, if you will. And there's a lot of data that can be pulled out of that, but it's not necessarily giving us a view of what the overall population really believes. It's giving us individuals' viewpoints. It's not giving us overall viewpoints, because those individuals are self-selecting into that sample. So the only people who are getting involved in that are the ones who feel as though their views need and should be heard. So it doesn't mean that people who if it says change my mind, I'm like, no, okay, I agree with that, so I keep walking on. I'm not going to have that conversation with him because I'm not wanting to change his mind. It might be a boring conversation. I'd say 2 + 2 is 4. He says, I agree. Okay, we're done. We shake hands. We move on with our lives. But the person who argues with him is where that particular dynamic comes into play. So there's that piece of it. So if you're setting up a table and saying, tell us your views on hot topic of the moment, might be abortion. So what are your views on abortion? And you sit down and someone gives you their viewpoints. So if someone's tired of talking about the scenario, then they're not going to talk with you about it, no matter how important the situation might actually be. Whether we're talking about biological boys playing girls sports, which is another hot topic in a discussion right now. Whether we're talking about whether pink should be worn with green. It doesn't really matter. The people who are going to respond to those questions are the people who have a vested interest on some level of wanting to have their voice heard in that situation and are bold enough to actually engage in that process. So voluntary response sample is good from one perspective of it only includes people's voices whose voices feel as though they should be heard. And that's an issue with that one. So as a general rule, it's an okay way to collect data, but it's not necessarily a good approach, not necessarily a best practice. Simple random sample. Now the idea behind a simple random sample is that we're creating a sample from a population, right? And we're setting up some type of system, if you will, that allows us to be able to assign every single person in the system the same likelihood as being chosen. So this is very different than a voluntary response system at the mall, where people can select in or out. I mean, this is even different than walking up to people in the mall and saying, may I ask you a few questions? Because even that particular issue, you say, well, that's a little bit more random with me just walking up to people. Yes, that might be a little bit more random, because then you're going and asking people to involve themselves, as opposed to just passively sitting at a table and asking them to involve themselves. But even then, they have the ability to say no and walk away. And on top of that, there is a bias introduced with you, because who are you picking? Are you picking people who look just like you? Are you picking people who don't look like you? I mean, what's the process you go by to pick people? Are you picking every third person that walks by? You start the count over when the third person says no, or you pick the fourth person? What type of system does that look like? And those are all valid ways of collecting data. You just need to make sure that you understand that you're not necessarily getting a random sample, and random is always going to be better in terms of overarching data for the group. What does that behavior for the group look like? So this idea here is that you're assigning equal likelihood to everybody within the population to pull your sample from. So let's say you have 1,000 people in the group or in the population. Okay, you might go ask all 1,000 people, or you could randomly select 100 of the people in that population. That would be your sample. It would be 100 people out of the population of 1,000. The sample would be 100. Now, how you pick those 100 people? You're saying that all 100 people are equally likely. So how do you pick their names? So one of the things that I kind of think back to on this one is called the hat trick. And I use that one in kind of as a generic term. The basic idea is that the more technical way of saying this is it's a table of random digits, or random digit table, or whatever, however you want to say that, different names for that. Basically what it comes down to is every participant is given a number. So if you're picking 100 people, you make the number 00 through 99. That's 100 digits. And you randomly select 10 of those people. Or if you're talking about 1,000 people, you make it 000 through 999. And again, there's 1,000 people. So now you're selecting 100 digits out of those 1,000 digits, and those are the people you pick. Or you literally just put people's names into a hat and you start pulling their names out of the hat, which in of itself is actually not necessarily the best idea, because how are you pulling those names out? Randomly picking numbers using some type of computer algorithm of some sort can make this a little bit more random. Now, the issue again with that, and this is where some of the bias ideas come in, is what if you pick person 11, 011, right? Or out of the 1,000, you pick 011 as that first person, but that person doesn't want to answer your questions. That creates a whole nother thing that we need to talk about here in the next set of slides, and we'll get to that. Okay, stratified random sample. This is a purposeful, this is putting some intentionality behind collecting your sample, okay? And the idea behind that is you want to make sure that when you pull your data, you're pulling, you're ensuring that you're pulling from groups that you need to hear from. Right? So if we have 1,000 people in our population, we're going to poll 100 and we do a stratified random sample. What we're going to say is that people 00 or 000 through 050, there's 51 of them, those people are of a particular subgroup that we need to make sure that are included in the overall sample. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that if we're picking 100 people out of the 1,000, we're going to make sure that those 50 people or 51 people are properly represented amongst the overall group. So we're going to ensure that, let's see here, 50 out of 1,000, so that'd be 5 out of 100 or 1 out of 20. So we're going to make sure that we pick 2 to 3 people out of that subgroup. We're going to ensure that 2 to 3 people out of that subgroup are included in our sample. And that's the idea behind stratified random sampling, is that we're purposefully or intentionally making sure that a particular subgroup or classification is included in something. Like if we're studying the trees and we're wanting to know how much oxygen is produced, and we want to make sure that we definitely include so many oak trees or so many pine trees or so many catawba trees. There's all sorts of different choices. Like we want to make sure that we definitely include trees that have needles instead of trees that have leaves, or we want to make sure that we include trees with rugged edges as opposed to smooth edges, because it changes something. I don't really know which, I'm not a botanist, but those different ideas is we would stratify that and say, make sure we want to include these different components when we start randomly picking things. We want to make sure we pick 2 oak trees, make sure we pick 2 catawba trees, make sure we pick 2 evergreens, whatever that is, okay? So that's the idea behind the stratified piece there. All right, a multi-stage sample. Now this is, the idea behind this one's a little different. It means that we're going to, this is used a lot in social constructs, is the idea that we're going to want to know more about a particular subgroup. And what we're going to do is we're going to first lock in on, say, a particular county, and then we're going to say we're going to pick particular households inside that county, and then we're going to pick particular members of each household. So we're not necessarily asking the entire county. We're going to pick particular households out of the county, or we're talking about a country, and we're picking particular states out of the country, and particular households out of the states, and then particular people out of the household. So it's a multi-stage sample where we kind of reduce it down a little bit into looking at a single microcosm of behavior, okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that that's the way we engineer the system of how we're collecting our data, or how our sample is built. So when we get our results, when we come to a conclusion, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to whether we can or cannot apply that on a generalized level? Do we have enough data, enough spread out data to make a conclusion about an entire population? Or have we only collected enough information to be able to determine stuff about a particular population? Like if we're studying the trees, did we learn everything about the trees, or did we just learn stuff about the oak trees? And there's nothing wrong with just studying a particular subgroup. We just need to make sure that we're doing it intentionally. Okay? So some cautionary issues. Undercoverage, which means that there are entire groups of the population that are left out. So we want to know how the U.S. population feels about gun control. But we only ask people who live in Vermont. Vermont is not a good representation of the entire country. All right. We want to know how people feel about fried chicken, but we only ask people in Oregon. All right. And I picked that up, those different topics, because when we talk about being someone who's grown up in the Deep South, those are topics that are very different viewpoints from a Southern perspective and a Northern perspective inside the same country. If you talk about pot use, the use of marijuana and other in some cases really hard drugs, like in the state of Oregon, a few years ago, over 60% of the population there voted to legalize those drugs, and essentially there be no legal ramifications for using them or possessing them inside the state. So if you were to ask people about their drug use preferences in Oregon versus, say, in, I don't know, Texas, you're probably going to get very different results. So the idea being is, are you undercovering the topic? Are you saying the U.S. population, and you fill in that blank with whatever it is the topic is and the results are, but your sample only came from Oregon, or your sample only came from Texas? Your results are going to be very different in both of those places as a result. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention to making sure that each group is covered properly. And this can even go into ethnic populations. Like you want to see about how well the educational system is doing at preparing individuals for upper level mathematics in high school. So you go and you sample only middle schools in affluent areas. Well, you're doing two things in that situation. You are purposefully undercovering populations that grow in economic distress, and you're also probably more than likely excluding certain ethnic groups as well from a large portion of that population, depending on where that data was collected from. And that's just something that probably corresponds as a result of those two interaction pieces there. All right. Next piece is non-response. Okay, and this isn't a real thing, and you can just keep track of these pieces as you're collecting your data. It is one thing. It says this is when an individual is actually contacted or asked to participate in a study, but refuses to participate, they've been asked to participate and they refuse to answer. The idea being here is, like, let's just say that we have a listing of 1,000 people, and we come across person 011, right? And we ask person 011 to participate in the study, and they don't respond to our email, they don't respond to our phone calls, they don't respond to our text messages, they just don't want to have anything to do, and they're not responding. That's called a non-response, and you need to make sure you have protocols in place for your sampling to deal with those things. Like after 3 or 4 attempts to contact, what do you then do? You exclude them from the study? What if at some point they actually decide to respond after you've invited them? What do you do at that point? You need to have protocols in place to deal with those situations. There's nothing wrong. It's not going to invalidate your study, but you need to make sure you have process in place to deal with that. Response bias. Now, this is a behavior either by the interviewer or by the respondent that might change the outcome of the answer. All right, so if you're talking about someone walks up and extremely angrily or very aggressively starts talking to you about the horrors or how horrible the destruction of oak trees are, well, is that going to change a person's response? Are they going to respond negatively to being yelled at, or are they going to also be enraged at the exact same time because the person asking them the questions is. So the idea of that response bias is what are the things the interviewer is bringing into those questioning process, and also the respondent. What does the respondent have? What are they bringing in that also will affect those response? Are they someone who grew up in a situation, they have certain baggage, if you will, that is going to change their outcomes and not necessarily answer the questions in the most effective or honest way? So you do need to be careful, especially when dealing with social constructs that might affect outcomes, and keep those things in mind. And a couple of things you can do to kind of bypass or get around some of that is the wording of your questions. Certain wordings might be difficult for certain individuals to understand. If you're talking about someone who's limited English, asking a question that has a lot of fancy unknown words, if you will, in the questions may not be the best choice, because you may run into people who's like, well, I don't really even know what you're asking me to do. And I've run into that myself. I have a PhD in curriculum and instruction in math education, and I have been talking to somebody and they have said something. I'm like, I have no clue what you just said. What are you? I don't even understand the words you're saying. We're both speaking English, and I have no idea what you are talking about. And to them, it's very clear, and to me, it's completely not clear. And so when we talk about our word affected, or the wording we're using in our questions, we need to make sure that we're using words that are at best, in best case scenario, are neutral in the way they approach a subject. They don't need to be leading. They don't need to be having any type of alternative motives in the wording, if at all possible. Saying things like, how horrible do you think the President of the United States is doing right now? Well, that's kind of a leading question. A better way to say that would be, what do you think of the President's current policies, or how effective do you feel as though the current president is doing right now with economic policies or with foreign policy or something like that? And then you make the answer response a range between very bad, very good, okay, and they need to answer somewhere in that continuum somewhere. So when we ask questions about, do you agree or disagree, or how strongly do you disagree on the following topic, and we make a statement, one of the things we can also do is we can, at some point, reverse the question and see if we get the reverse answer. Meaning, in one place, tell us how much you agree or disagree, and on question one is, the president is currently doing a horrible job on foreign policy. Do you strongly agree or disagree? And then later down in the survey, we say, the president is doing a wonderful job with foreign policy. You strongly agree or disagree? What we should see is a correlation where the two answers get flip-flopped in the responses for people. So if they answered strongly agreed on one, they should be answering strongly disagree on the other. But if they're not answering reverse, then we know our question is causing some bias to be introduced somehow. Okay, so those are their pieces. Now, last piece of this, and then we'll stop. Technology. Technology is both a wonderful thing for collecting data, and it's also a horrible thing for collecting data. And it's just something to be aware of, because there's not a whole lot you can do about it. The only thing you can really manage is managing the problems it produces. So web surveys. If you go to Facebook and you post a survey on Facebook, who's taking the survey? Well, only the people you're friends with. And if you ask people to repost it onto their pages, they might do that, but then you're still talking about a very small subgroup of people who know each other. You're not necessarily getting out there and getting answers to people that are completely unknown to you and outside your network. Same thing with Twitter. If you just tweet it out, where the only people that are going to really see that are going to be the people who are your followers, or if someone were to re-share that at a larger level for you, then you might get more responses. But again, it's still locked into your network. So when we talk about web surveys, how do you get the intended surveys to the intended population? How do you collect that data effectively? Because the only people who are going to choose, and this is that self-selection piece, right? The only people that are going to volunteer to respond to those things are the people who want to volunteer to respond to those, especially when it's passive like that. I see those all the time. He's like, take this survey. No, thank you. And you move on with your life. Why would you want to spend 30 minutes taking a survey for someone else's benefit? There are reasons why you want to do that. And by leading in saying, please take this survey because, and explain why you want the data collected, that might actually cause some response issues as well, okay? But again, we can run into the problem where we are undercovering subgroups, and we also will run into the situation where we will get non-responses from intended subgroups. So there are all those issues with web survey problems. Another piece of this is cell phone problems. Cell phones are great from a lot of perspectives, but one of the problems that we run into, and this used to be a really good way to collect data, was to do a polling via phone. So you just call, you pull up a whole collection of numbers out of a particular region, and you start calling random phone numbers in that region. And the person who answers the phone, you just simply say, hey, do you fit this criteria? Like we were talking about politics. May I talk to an adult in the household? The phone gets handed off to an adult and they start asking the questions, right? Well, the cell phone issue is a little bit more complicated because you can pull numbers from a particular area of the United States. It doesn't mean that that's where you're calling. My cell phone number does not start from the region that I currently live in. The area code does not match the region I live in. So if someone were to call my area code, they would be thinking I'm living in a different part of the country. And that's actually run into some problems with some people when I've tried to get phone calls back because they think I have the wrong number. But and that is the ultimate issue with the cell phone problem, is that location issue. If you're trying to identify a particular demographic, if you're trying to identify and ask people questions who live in Missouri, so you call area codes from Missouri, you don't know whether people picking up the phone on the other end actually currently live in Missouri or not, because of it might be a cell phone. The other piece of that is screening calls. If someone doesn't answer their phone, if it's a number they don't recognize, they're screening their phone calls, and then they say, please call us back. Well, how many people are going to call back an unknown person who wants them to take a survey? So again, that becomes a problem with that data collection. All right, so I may have produced more problems than answers for you, but the overarching idea here is that when we collect data, we want to be very intentional about making sure we randomize the data collection as much as we can. We want to try to minimize the bias that's introduced as much as we can, and we want to simplify the wording in the best way possible to ensure that we're not introducing additional issues into the sample. All right, so I hope this was useful, hope this was helpful, and if you need additional discussion or further examples on any of these topics, please reach out and let me know, and I'll produce another video on this as soon as I can. Take care.